for our webinar, From Insight to Action, Intelligence-Based Corruption Prevention, to mark International Anti-Corruption Day. I'm Alison Byrne, CEO at IBAC, and I'll be facilitating today's event. I'd like to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional custodians of the lands that we are broadcasting from. I'm on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay respects to their elders past and present. The Wurundjeri people take their name from the Woiwurrung language word Wurrung, meaning the manna gum, which is common along Birrarung, the Yarra River, and Jerry, the grub which is found in or near the tree. Wurundjeri are the Witchetty Grub people, and their ancestors have lived on this land for millennia. The Wurundjeri Woiwurrung season for December is Garrawang, or kangaroo apple season, which is known for changeable, thundery weather. Days are long and nights are short. Fruits appear on kangaroo apple bushes and barley is fruiting. This is also the breeding time of the creation being, Bunjil. I respectfully acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands and waterways across Australia and pay respect to elders past and present and to all First Nations people joining us today. 20 years ago, the UN General Assembly adopted the Convention Against Corruption and designated the 9th of December as International Anti-Corruption Day to raise awareness of corruption and how to combat and prevent it. Australia ratified the convention in 2005. Now, before I introduce the panel that you'll be hearing from today, a few points of housekeeping. Firstly, there's a button in the meeting controls to turn on closed captions if you'd like this tool. You can also click the interpretation button to see our Auslan interpreters. You can submit questions to the panel through the Q&A button. Please note, of course, that we can't answer any questions about ongoing investigations. A recording of the webinar will be made available on the IBAC website in coming weeks. So today we have three highly experienced integrity professionals making up the panel. Deputy Commissioner David Wolfe joined IBAC in 2020, bringing a broad range of skills, expertise and deep understanding of regulatory, integrity, communication, public sector and council administration matters. Prior to joining IBAC, David was Victoria's inaugural Chief Municipal Inspector and Head of the Local Government Inspectorate. IBAC's Executive Director of Prevention and Communication, Dr. Linda Timothy, who joined IBAC in 2022. Linda leads IBAC's Strategic Intelligence, Prevention Policy and Research, Communication and Engagement teams. She commenced her career as a researcher in the UK, where she published several peer-reviewed research papers, and her career includes roles across public policy, communications, as well as delivering organisational and legislative reform. Finally, Tracy Cheung is the Manager of Integrity at Department of Health, with over 15 years of experience in the integrity sector. Her career includes roles with the Integrity and Oversight Committee, as well as serving as a senior lawyer at IBAC, WA's Corruption and Crime Commission, and South Australia's Independent Commissioner Against Corruption. As we hear from these presenters today, I encourage you to consider what intelligence you might have that can help you in your anti-corruption activities. Now, this might include some of the IBAC's resources that you hear about today. How well do the integrity risks we identify apply to your workplace or government services that you use? And what can you do to prevent fraud and corruption in your workplace? Now, we're going to leave plenty of time for questions at the end. Some of you, or many of you, submitted questions when you registered for this webinar, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. And we encourage you to continue to ask questions throughout today via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. I'd now like to invite David to talk to us about the human factor. What can we learn from people's perceptions of corruption?
Great. Thanks, Alison, and hi everyone. Thanks for joining in today. As Alison noted, we can learn a lot from people's perception of corruption. And at IBAC, we conduct surveys of Victorian public sector and local government employees to understand how they perceive corruption and integrity within their own organisations. The results inform our corruption prevention work and investigative activity and provides public sector agencies with contemporary data on where staff see corruption risks and what are some of the key behaviours that increase that risk. This year, the survey sought the opinions of state and local government employees, Victoria Police employees, business suppliers to government, and the Victorian community to better understand their knowledge of corruption, perceptions of its prevalence, and attitudes towards reporting. The surveys explore awareness and perceptions of IBAC, perceived prevalence of the public sector, corruption and police misconduct, understanding of the types of behaviours that are corrupt or misconduct, and how likely people would be to report it if they saw it, and to whom. Online surveys were undertaken between April and May this year, and I'll now share with you some of the key findings. So this year we surveyed 9,000 people across the sectors I mentioned: state and local government, Victoria Police, business suppliers to state and local government, and the Victorian community. These groups were surveyed back in 2022, and we surveyed them every 2 years. In the alternate years, we surveyed members of parliament and councillors. So to the survey results, and let's start with the top 3 behaviours that indicate a risk of corrupt conduct occurring as provided by the respondents. The first is where people engage in favouritism or nepotism, particularly in recruitment or procurement activity, and where there is unfairness in the process or extending to a personal benefit for the public officer who makes a decision. The second relates to inaction, where people fail to adhere to policies or processes or fail to properly exercise their function, particularly in relation to delegated powers of decision making. And thirdly, a breach of professional boundaries, which includes things like bullying and harassment, that indicates to us a culture where corruption is likely to go unchecked or unchallenged. And now to the broader survey results. Of the nearly 2,800 Victorian government employees who participated, 90% agreed that they know what constitutes corruption or corrupt behaviour. A positive finding across all survey groups was that most people believe that they know what behaviour constitutes corruption, and that if they personally observe it, they would report it. And while there's broad agreement that corruption exists in Victoria, there are differing views about the extent to which this is a problem. So the majority of respondents, at around 69%, agree that corruption is a problem in Victoria, which is a slight increase when compared from 66% in 2022. The proportion who told us in 2024 that they agree corruption is a problem in their workplace is at 30%, which is up from 24% in 2022, and this is one of the changes that we found of particular note. 74% of respondents consider their organisation vulnerable to corruption and misconduct, either moderately, around 60%, or highly at 13%. Pleasingly though, 79% of employees believe the ethical culture of their organisation to be either moderately or strong. But that means around 21% of respondents rate the ethical culture of their organisation as weak, which indicates there is work to be done in this area. One of the encouraging results from the survey was that 81% of respondents agreed that they would report corruption or misconduct if they personally observed it. And while this number is slightly down from the 2022 survey, it still points to a positive speak-up culture, but with some scope to improve. And one of those areas for the sector to focus on is the understanding and confidence in how to make a report, with the survey telling us that 68% of respondents who know how to make a report, there's still significant scope to increase that understanding across the entire workforce. Additionally, the survey tells us that government and Victoria Police employees are much more likely than community members to know how to report corruption. So for IBAC and the sector, we have more work to do with the community in building that awareness as well. The overall results show us that audience groups show strong intentions to report corruption and misconduct, but there are variations on the perceptions of whether the report will be taken seriously or not. Interestingly, the proportion who believe reports of corruption or misconduct would be treated as seriously has consistently decreased since the inception of these surveys, with just over half, around 57%, believing their report would probably or definitely be treated seriously in the 2024 survey. So with immediate managers nominated by 65% of respondents as the most likely channel for reporting corruption and misconduct, a key focus area is to ensure managers and supervisors have the capability to properly deal with any reports. Now, moving to the topic of perceptions of business suppliers, and perceptions of corruption in the government procurement have worsened over time. Almost 9 in 10 business suppliers who responded consider corruption in government procurement and the processes to be an issue, with 41% perceiving it to be a major problem. Of concern, the belief that problematic corruption within government procurement has become more pervasive since 2016, with the proportion viewing it as a major problem, steadily increasing with each of our survey waves. Heightened perceptions of corruption being a major problem in procurement may well be driven by recent media attention in that sector. Respondents, particularly in the construction and commercial sectors, were significantly more likely to view corruption as a major problem in public sector procurement. That was 50% and 54% respectively. Across business suppliers, the 3 greatest perceived corruption risks were favouritism in the procurement processes, gifts or benefits being offered to those with procurement responsibilities, followed by the unequal distribution of information and the leaking of confidential supplier information during the tender process. It's really important for those working in procurement to be alive to these perceptions and proactive in protecting against these risks. So what can we do as a collective to address the perceptions revealed in this survey? And noting that these focus areas are derived from the survey and IBAC's prevention material. The first is to build on the speak up culture through enhanced staff training, building confidence in how to make a report, who to, and the protections available for those making a report. The second is to equip people managers to appropriately handle complaints if and when they receive them. The third is, to the extent possible, focus on transparency regarding the actions and decisions being taken in the organisation. And what we see is, in the absence of information, people may perceive impropriety. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, really work on the management and leadership culture for your organisation. As we constantly see in our work and where we are investigating corruption, the culture is often the enabling factor. So that brings me to the end of the material I wanted to share. I hope it's been informative and initiated some thought about your own organisation and workplace. I'll hand back to Alison to introduce the next component.
Thank you for your insights, David. So that's what people think and feel about corruption. But what does the hard data tell us? I'd like to invite Linda to talk to us about the strategic analysis IBAC has done, looking at corruption risk profiles.
Thanks, Alison. Well, it's great to be here today. And as we've heard from David, IBAC collects a lot of data. And the data comes from a variety of sources, including the survey data that David spoke about. But we also collect information from allegations we receive, both from organisations and the public, insights from our investigations and reviews, consultations and collaborations with agencies, departments and Victoria Police. And together, this provides us with a really rich source of intelligence about corruption risks in the Victorian public sector and the police. And this information, together with the detailed understanding that individual organisations have about how their particular organisation works, what the culture is like and what motivates their people, provides a strong foundation for effective, intelligence-led corruption prevention. And that's why we've published risk profiles and strategic analyses so that organisations have access to our insights and can develop their own strategies to prevent corruption, to encourage reporting and manage complaints. So the first thing that I'd like to mention are the sector profiles. These are corruption risk profiles that have been developed for different sectors. These profiles include an overview of the sector, its specific corruption and misconduct risks, general information on allegations received by IBAC about the sector, and insights from IBAC's investigations and reviews. They've been designed to support people working in each of these sectors to better understand the corruption and misconduct risks that are unique to them and provide guidance on ways to minimise and prevent corruption and misconduct. And in developing them, we consulted directly with people working in the sectors to better understand what they see as their major risks and what information would help them to respond better to them. The profiles aim to inform public sector leaders and others about key corruption risks and the underlying drivers by offering a snapshot of their sector's main vulnerabilities. And at IBAC, we'll be regularly updating this information to include emerging risks and lessons learned. So to take one example, in the education sector, we found that key corruption risks in schools are around financial management. Whereas in comparison in universities, the risks are commonly related to people management, including recruitment and promotions. And we also learned that an important prevention strategy in that sector, in the education sector, involves regular mandatory training, including training of private sector employees. And that's because the size of the education sector, the wide variety of entities, and the intersection between the public and private sectors means that many people may not even be aware in that sector of the corruption risks that they're expected to prevent or manage. So each of these sector profiles also includes corruption prevention strategies and tailored ways to detect corruption, along with relevant resources such as investigation case studies that IBAC has developed. To take just one other example from Corrections and Youth Justice, we found that maintaining a transparent and accountable decision-making framework was pivotal to preventing corruption in that sector. And separately, training was really important to ensure that employees could both understand and implement the complex hierarchy of rules. And we hope that these profiles will be particularly useful to leaders, to teams that are responsible for integrity, governance and risk in the Victorian Public Service, but they'll also be of interest to anyone who wants to understand and gain insight into the corruption risks in Victoria. So moving on to our strategic assessments, we've published one of our periodic assessments of Victoria Police, and these identify emerging and enduring misconduct risks. This work involved extensive analysis of research, allegations, incidents and cases from across Victoria and Australia and internationally, as well as consultation. At IBAC, we use this information to inform our decision-making, planning and priorities. However, the information is also published on our website to assist Victoria Police and for public access. And we've also just completed a strategic assessment of the state public sector and local government. Again, the work was designed to identify enduring and emerging corruption risks in Victoria and involved reviewing current and emerging corruption trends in Australia and worldwide, as well as consultation with over 30 public sector and local government organisations. And this included departments, agencies, health services, regulators and local councils, both in metropolitan and regional Victoria. And the results of this research, this most recent research, and the insights derived from it will be published in a series of information products and prevention resources in early 2025. And lastly, I'm also very pleased to announce that on Anti-Corruption Day, IBAC will launch our first corruption allegations dashboard later this week. The dashboard will be available on our website, and it enables you to view and search for corruption allegations that relate to departments and agencies and local government. It allows you to filter, or will allow you to filter by organisation type or sector, by the organisation's name and local government area. And importantly, the dashboard will also enable users to search for the types of allegations that IBAC receives. It categorises alleged corrupt conduct and alleged corrupt behaviour, as well as categorising the type of function or the activity the allegation relates to. This will be the first time we've released this data publicly, and our intention is to improve transparency and understanding of the types of corruption allegations that are prevalent in each sector. The information is de-identified to protect the anonymity of those who make the reports. However, it provides enough detail to allow users to understand what kind of corruption risks may be more prevalent in each sector. And we hope it will be a useful tool for public sector staff, researchers, and the community. So keep an eye out for our upcoming Insights newsletter, which will include a link to the dashboard, or go to our website and subscribe to Insights if you don't already receive it. And as you can see on this slide, the details of the sectoral profiles and strategic assessments we have published are set out here, and the ones that we plan to publish in 2025. The majority of the data that IBAC is able to use to develop these insights and assessments comes from people who report their concerns about corruption to us or to their organisation. Even where we don't launch a full investigation or provide formal recommendations to an organisation, the information and data helps us to identify trends and emerging risks. Public release of this data and the insights that can be gained from it are important tools for public sector organisations to use to build and strengthen their own corruption resistance. And I'll just also take the opportunity to mention that there is more information on our website about how to report suspected corruption and misconduct. I really encourage you to explore all of these resources on the website and see how we've translated our data into practical steps organisations can implement to build a culture of integrity. Thanks, Alison.
Thank you, Linda, and I really do recommend all of those great resources to you all. Next, I'd like to invite Tracy Chung to share with us the use of strategic intelligence to inform the Department of Health's corruption prevention initiatives.
Thank you, Alison. Imagine this. You're tasked with rapidly assembling a large workforce, much like we did during COVID. Many of these individuals have never worked in the public sector before. So how then do we effectively communicate the standards and values expected of a public officer? This was the challenge our Deputy Secretary posed to us in 2022. And today, I'm here to share how we approach these questions and why we chose gamification as our strategy. When it comes to ethics and compliance, we could have simply delivered mandated information, legal requirements, policies and procedures, without much focus on engagement. Or we could strive for real behavioural change by enhancing the retention of information and skills. We chose the latter. Think about it. How many of you remember the case studies from those countless e-learning modules? Likely very few. But how often do we discuss books or films after experiencing them? That's because storytelling resonates with people. It connects emotionally and makes information more likely to stick. So we built our gamified storyline to reflect real-world challenges. The game includes moments of hesitation, the temptation to rationalise poor decisions, and the importance of seeking advice from trusted advisors to make informed choices. We also wanted people to see themselves in the story. To achieve this, we included lines drawn from real-life experiences, situations where concerns have been brushed aside. Because sadly, this is a reality many face when they speak up. And acknowledging it helped make the narrative authentic and relatable. In designing our game, we wanted to go beyond traditional ethics training. We drew inspiration from Professor Mary Gentile's Giving Voice to Values, which shifts the focus from simply knowing what's right to the more challenging task of acting on that knowledge. In our game, players step into the role of a private detective investigating allegations of fraud and corruption at a prestigious pet gala. As the player, you encounter integrity red flags, collect evidence, and engage with allies who guide you through complex ethical decisions. Each level of the game tackles key integrity topics such as managing offers of gifts, benefits, and hospitality, addressing conflicts of interest, and handling public interest disclosures. The module also fosters self-awareness, helping players understand how even well-intentioned people can unknowingly become complicit in unethical behaviour. By combining gamification with a giving voice to values approach, we're helping our staff develop the necessary ethical muscle memory to more confidently navigate ethical challenges. Other ways we've integrated gamification into our integrity initiatives are Cards for Integrity, a resource we developed to spark staff engagement with key integrity topics, and Integrity Hot Seat, which we launched at an executive leadership forum on integrity earlier this year. The latter was designed to challenge our executives and push them beyond their comfort zones. The response has been so positive that several leaders have since reached out to us to facilitate the game for their teams. With cards, we embedded a QR code that links to relevant integrity resources or investigation outcomes from IBAC's website. After analysing the results, we discovered that staff engaged with the card relating to public interest disclosures by a ratio of 3:1 compared to other integrity topics. This data has been incredibly valuable, helping to shape the focus of our corruption prevention initiatives, including the one I'm about to share. At our department, we found that staff do speak up about their concerns, but there's a recurring issue we've heard from disclosures. Many feel discouraged where their concerns are dismissed or ignored. Not all disclosures expect that every allegation will lead to an investigation or wrongdoers will be brought to justice. What they really want is to feel genuinely heard, to know their efforts to bring about positive change are listened to and valued. However, when there's no timely update, or worse, no response at all, they lose trust in the system. And as trust erodes, so does their willingness to speak up again. No matter how strong our speak up messaging is, without proper follow through, it simply will not work. Recognising this, our team made it a priority to focus on improving accountability and responsiveness to disclosures, to shift the focus from the disclosure to the leaders in our organisation who need to act on the disclosure. We researched what other jurisdictions are doing, what innovative approaches exist, and we came across the National Guardian Initiative, which is the UK equivalent to our public interest disclosure scheme in the health sector. This initiative was born out of Sir Robert Francis QC's 2015 Freedom to Speak Up report, which identified that workers often felt unsupported when raising concerns, leading to negative outcomes for both staff and patients. The National Guardian's Office was established to change this. It supports over 1,200 Freedom to Speak Up guardians across the National Health Service. These guardians ensure workers feel safe to raise concerns that impact their ability to do their jobs effectively. And it isn't just about integrity, but all aspects of their work. The Office also conducts reviews to strengthen the Speak Up culture within the health sector. In addition, we connected with eIntegrity, a community interest company that develops online learning resources for the NHS and healthcare professionals worldwide. They generously provided us with access to their Speak Up, Listen Up, Follow Up modules, which have been invaluable. These resources have helped us enhance our own initiatives and build a stronger framework to support disclosures, making sure they feel heard and valued and restoring trust in the reporting system.
A healthy Speak Up, Listen Up, Follow Up culture is one which has speaking up as business as usual at its core, an acknowledgement of the barriers people face to speaking up, understanding where they exist, who they affect, and actively works to reduce them. Leaders who listen with gratitude and respond with curiosity rather than defensiveness. An approach that puts people before process. A learn not blame attitude to dealing with issues, and a willingness to embrace suggestions to improve ways of working. The means to capture and implement learning and give meaningful feedback to people who speak up. An acceptance that complacency in driving a healthy speaking up culture has no place in an ever-changing, integrating environment where the goal is to beat your best.
The NHS training modules are designed to cascade, so everyone does the Speak Up. Middle managers do the Listen Up as well, and senior managers do all three, but anyone can access all content. They specifically target leadership, demonstrating how important their first response and action is when someone speaks up. Our team works very closely with other business units to embed this messaging across the department. Our goal is to ensure that speaking up isn't seen as something relevant only to integrity issues like fraud or corruption. We want to normalise this behaviour as part of everyday interactions, encouraging everyone to voice their opinions openly and constructively. We also encourage leaders not to perceive those who speak up as problematic or time wasters. One practical way to start, inspired by Professor Gentili's approach, is to offer positive and constructive feedback to your colleagues. This applies whether they're at your level, junior, or senior. Just as important, those receiving feedback should make an effort to show appreciation and gratitude for it. By consistently practicing this behaviour, it becomes less intimidating to speak up when the stakes are higher, like when raising a serious integrity concern. Building this habit strengthens trust and over time will make speaking up feel like a natural part of workplace culture. Thank you, and I'll now hand back to Alison.
Thank you, Tracy. There's some really great and creative examples of how we can rethink the way we deliver corruption prevention education. So we're now ready to take some of your questions for the panel. Remember that you can ask questions through the QA button in the control panel. We've got some questions already. To everybody on the panel, to what extent is culture an important factor in corruption prevention? Perhaps David?
Perhaps I start off by identifying how much of an issue it is. I think if we reflect on our investigative activity, and particularly those matters where we've substantiated corrupt conduct, often you can trace it back to culture within the organisation, and whether that be a culture at lower levels where the conduct's been permitted and allowed to happen for quite some period of time, but even the culture of the leadership of the organisation who might have been heavily involved in the corrupt activity. So for us, we see the culture of the organisation as clearly an enabling factor for either the corrupt conduct to commence and certainly for it to flourish over a period of time.
Linda or Tracy?
Oh, I think the best definition I've ever heard of culture is really, it's the way we really do things around here. So I think organisations can have the best policies, procedures, whatever they like, in place, but if people aren't following them, if people are not implementing those policies and procedures, they become just, dusty volumes on the shelf. I think it's what we often refer to as the integrity system. In the integrity system, everything has to be operating in concert. Everybody has to be working in the same direction. So culture is really fundamental to prevention.
Culture is probably the most important part of corruption prevention. It's what drives good conduct. You do not want to be continually investigating allegations of corruption. It gets very expensive for your organisation. Culture reduces the likelihood of corruption occurring in your organisation. And I know it may sound like a corporate buzzword at times, but having a good culture will save your organisation a lot of pain and a lot of money.
Here. I think picking up what all of you said, to me, culture is about what's expected and what's accepted. So to your point, Linda, around policies and procedures and so forth, that's all well and good, but then what do you do about it in practice? What is accepted, not just expected? Next question for both Linda and Tracy. What is best practice after an organisation has an IBAC report published about them?
Great question. I think from our perspective, once we published a report about an investigation and made recommendations for change, it's great from our perspective if organisations look at those recommendations holistically, look at the report holistically, and consider really what the intent was. So from our perspective, we will follow up, we will ask for reporting on implementation of those recommendations, and we'll continue to engage. And we can be there to support and provide advice if it's needed, but fundamentally it's about really looking at the whole and looking at how the intent really of the recommendations, which is always to prevent a similar incident happening again.
And Tracy?
Yes. First thing I'll say is that you want to avoid blame culture. Be open to IBAC's recommendations. That doesn't mean that you need to blindly accept the recommendations, but if you believe they have merit, accept them, then communicate it to your team and to your relevant stakeholders. And then follow up on the progress of the implementation of recommendations as one form of accountability.
Definitely. So the next question, when managing alleged internal corruption, how do we best or reasonably balance oversight and staff privacy? Perhaps one for you, Tracy.
Thanks, Alison. Balancing oversight and staff privacy is a very delicate process that requires adherence to principles of confidentiality, fairness and transparency. As a starting point, you should consult the relevant legislation. That would be the Public Interest Disclosure Act or IBAC's Act. Other relevant factors will be to observe the privacy provisions in legislation such as the Privacy and Data Protection Act, or for us, the Health Records Act. You should always adhere to the principles of procedural fairness and then follow the relevant procedures or guidelines on managing internal allegations. And for a lot of agencies, this will be set out in your fraud, corruption and other losses policy. And they usually cover limiting information disclosure on a need-to-know basis and ensuring all parties are aware of their responsibilities and roles, particularly in relation to confidentiality.
Great. Ooh, we've got a good one for you, David. Are there geopolitical collusion and laundered money layering and integration risks in council planning and procurement activities?
Complex question. I think the answer's relatively simple though. I often talk about the risk where there's significant transfer of public funds to the private sector for goods or services, or a decision that will result in a windfall, so a benefit to a party that's involved in the process. And where you've got those elements involved, it's really important that there's an understanding across the sector that there is people out there or groups that sit there and think about how they're going to corrupt the system to benefit themselves. So I think that might be generated from a real local level. It might be organised crime syndicates. It might be from foreign actors, but the risk is the same. So the risk presents the same with all the activities that I've spoken about. So what we need to think about and continually need to think about is how good our systems and processes are, how good our detection and prevention efforts are, how well we would share information amongst like agencies, what our awareness level is of new threats, and how we might report things both internally, so even at the lowest level in a procurement process or a planning process, whether someone might be aware or come across information that is concerning, that how well the reporting chains are known, and to escalate that sort of material, and or to a agency like ours or an intelligence-based agency. If we go back to the question about what's the prevalence of foreign actors, what I'd say is it's not high, but it's there, and it's worth that the sector is really aware that it is another risk that presents.
So how do you evaluate and measure the impact of corruption prevention initiatives? How are you measuring the success of your prevention strategies? Tricky one. Maybe start with you, Tracy.
Thanks, Alison. Measuring impact of your corruption prevention initiatives is not a very easy task. You can't just focus on one measure. You could look at things like how many staff members complete your training modules, but that might not be as meaningful as data like the number of persons who make public interest disclosures or the amount of staff who decline an offer of gift benefits or hospitality. Our integrity team also monitors feedback from disclosures, and we also analyse the integrity indicators from the People Matters survey. It's early days, but what we're looking for in terms of impact is an increased level of interest and engagement from our staff on integrity topics and from our leadership team. So, for example, this year was the first year that our department recognised leading with integrity as a category in our end of year awards, and we think that this is a more meaningful way to see impact in the integrity space.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a really difficult question. It's incredibly difficult. Impact measures are incredibly difficult. It's something that we look at IBAC as well. How do we measure the impact of our corruption prevention initiatives? And I would agree, I think, with what Tracy had to say, that it's not one measure. It has to be a combination of measures. In addition to all of the things that Tracy mentioned, some of the things we do is seek feedback on the intention to take action following some of our corruption prevention initiatives. So not just was the information useful, but do you intend to do something with the information? Yeah, it's always a difficult one. And the other thing that we are interested in currently is surveying trust, both trust in IBAC, trust in other organisations. Is that a good measure? But we're experimenting, and we'll have to continue to do it.
So maybe one for you, David. Who watches the watchdog, and what process is available and used, and how foolproof is transparency in the public interest?
Okay. Yeah, it is. I'll take it as the first part of the question. So who watches the watchdog? And I think that's a really important question. So in Victoria, there's an integrity system which involves a number of agencies that have really important roles who oversight particular aspects of the public sector and local government and how they perform. To do that role, many of the agencies have powers which they exercise to be able to ensure that the sectors are performing, as I said, as is expected. The use of those powers are important, but it comes with great responsibility. And accordingly, there is an oversight regime in Victoria for the integrity system. And it starts with a body called the Victorian Inspectorate, who have a role in ensuring compliance with the law of those integrity bodies and ensuring that any complaints are dealt with in respect to those bodies. And then over and above that, there's a committee of Parliament called the Integrity Oversight Committee, who have a role, again, of oversighting the performance of the Victorian Inspectorate and the integrity regime as well. So there's a number of layers there to ensure the system's working in accordance with the way the legislators intended, which is what the community want and intended as well. And going to the last part of the question, I think it's really important. I mentioned transparency in my opening remarks, and it's incredibly important that, to the extent possible, public sector agencies and bodies can be transparent around their decision making and action. So giving not only the outcome, but a reason for the outcome. And that's something that we've worked on here at IBAC as well, to make sure that when we tell people an outcome of what we're doing, that we give some reasons and rationale behind it. Because in the absence of that, there's always a suspicion that the matter hasn't been properly looked into, and that creates angst within the community. And lastly, if I can just call out the role of the media in transparency as well. So the integrity system is incredibly important, but the media still do and play a very important role in ensuring that concerns of the community are looked into and well publicised. And of course, we monitor what the media are reporting as well. It helps our intelligence gathering and helps us look at where we might focus our energy. So that's an important aspect of the oversight regime.
And just on the point of the media, a lot of our evaluations have showed that members of the community are reporting back their understanding and awareness of corruption and conduct does indeed come from the media. So really important tool and an ally in terms of corruption prevention. Maybe one for you, Linda. What do advances in AI mean for intelligence gathering for corruption prevention?
Yeah, thanks, Alison.
You're welcome.
It's a really tough question. And I know that currently our intelligence teams and our technical teams are really looking at what that means for IBAC and how IBAC can harness really the power of artificial intelligence and machine learning for IBAC. But I guess I'd answer it more broadly by saying that for corruption prevention and for public sector organisations, AI and machine learning really presents a range of threats and opportunities, as it does for every organisation. I suppose that it really comes down to the design and to the information that's input into the system. It's really only as good as the design. So, on the downside, I suppose artificial intelligence systems can be deliberately designed to enable corruption. They can have false information put into them to enable corruption, or inadvertently, for example, private or sensitive information can be input in, and that can lead to risks such as, privacy risks and release of either inadvertent or deliberate release of private information. On the plus side, though, they can be really useful for things like fraud detection, for identity verification, and I think there's real power in predictive modelling of AI. So it's a high level and a broad answer, I guess. But yeah, something I think that we'll be grappling with for some time to come.
I think so. Are there any tools or approaches to ensuring that CVs and claimed qualifications or experience of potential employees or existing employees are actually real? Yes. Yes. That's one that I can answer. Yes, there are. Depending on the agency or the organisation undertaking the recruitment, there's obviously things internal, in-house, around police checks and so forth, more broadly, that might go to those experience, but there are a number of providers where you can outsource the qualifications checks and experience checks to those providers. Perhaps if you're dealing with qualifications from overseas, it can be a little more difficult. Definitely would outsource on those occasions. But a larger team in the people and culture teams or HR teams can indeed conduct some of those checks internally. One for you, Tracy. That game sounds brilliant. Is it available to be shared with VPS departments?
Thanks, Mum, for asking that question. But seriously, yes, we can make that available, and I know I'm in touch with quite a few integrity managers across the VPS, so feel free to get in touch with my team and we can make that available.
Thank you. What are your biggest tips for PID coordinators to effectively communicate integrity education to staff? That's public interest disclosure coordinators.
Sure. Really important function under the Public Interest Disclosure Act. Each agency and local government have a role which is termed a public interest coordinator, disclosure coordinator, and that role plays a really important part in the receipt of a disclosure and the management of that disclosure, and also the engagement and education function within the organisation. I think the biggest tip for someone in that role is to firstly have a really sound understanding of the legislation and the interaction with our agency as the custodians of the Public Interest Disclosure Act. And then secondly, the engagement activity across the organisation to ensure that all staff, employees are aware of the public interest disclosure regime, are able to access it and understand the implications of making a report under that scheme. So for me, it's the education and engagement factor is the most important part of it. Second to that is having that connection with this organisation. So if they have a tricky issue, to make sure they know who to contact in this organisation to provide them advice and assistance.
Right. Linda?
And if I could just add to what David said, give a shout out for our tools and resources. We've got a couple of e-learning modules on our website. We've got some tip sheets and tools on our website that might be helpful. It's a really complex scheme, but we do our best to simplify it and make it understandable.
And can you give any practical guidance on how to highlight positive speak-up experience where most disclosers wish to remain anonymous? Gosh. Tracy?
Yeah.
Because we have actually, as part of our integrity communications plan each year, we try and find ways to increase engagement or the level of trust in our public interest disclosure scheme. And what better way to do that than just to rely on the feedback of disclosers. What I will say first is make sure that you seek their consent, but we find that most of our disclosers are very altruistic, and we try to appeal to their sense of public duty, and they feel very good about making an impact and making it easier for future public interest disclosures.
Perhaps if I could add, one of the questions I often get asked is how can you have confidence in a disclosure regime when there's some high profile issues around the country where disclosures have been perhaps outed and there's a perception it might be unfair. My answer to that is what you don't see is when it works by virtue of the system working. And I can assure people that are watching this that we deal with many, many public interest disclosures on a weekly basis. And the system works incredibly well to ensure that their matter is dealt with appropriately. And again, to the extent possible, that confidentiality is number one priority. There are circumstances, of course, in the investigation of matters where it is impossible to not disclose where the material come from. But in the bulk of the cases, as I said, it is possible to initiate an investigation without that being a primary issue.
I think the other aspect to that question, of course, is an internal speak-up culture. So I can speak on behalf of IBAC that we have a number of different layers to our internal disclosures, internal complaints and speak-up culture. And yes, there are a number of anonymous complaints that can be raised in any organisation, and it's really difficult then to balance how to show that you are listening and trying to do things when you can't necessarily get back to the disclosure. So I think here and in other organisations really working on how you can balance perhaps some data or issues to not expose the area or perhaps the person who made a disclosure or made a complaint, but still show the organisation more broadly that we have acted on something, we have heard something, we've done it. So it's a difficult balance, but it can be done. Final question. So often we have employees who have come from suppliers that we already buy services from. How do we ensure that those staff members maintain integrity in the work? Are there any suggestions you may have to ensure we maintain integrity when engaging with suppliers, especially by former employees of those suppliers who now work for government?
Yeah. It's a theme that arises often in our complaint and investigation material. What I would say is that one of the key elements of employing people into the public sector is ensuring there is a very sound induction process, that the policies, processes of the organisation are well communicated and the values of the organisation are well known. And often that can come in complete contrast from the sector which employees have come from, where gifts and hospitality are part and parcel of the work. So being very clear about expectations, values of the organisation and consequences for breaching those processes and policies. I think that's really important. For your existing workforce, I think continually reiterating the importance of that fairness and integrity in decision making, and that external parties will look to befriend, ingratiate, even groom employees if they think it's going to deliver advantage. So be ever vigilant for approaches from external parties, particularly if they're offering gifts and hospitality. They're not doing it because they want to be friends.
And I would just add to that, and it seems like the obvious one, but it isn't always obvious, have a really robust conflict of interest system in place, and that's not just actual conflicts, that's perceived conflicts, potential conflicts. Make sure you have a really robust system in place, everybody knows about it, and make declarations just part of business as usual.
Well, that's almost it. So thank you for joining us today, and a big thank you again to David, Linda and Tracy, and all of the attendees and organisers for your contributions to today's webinar. We'll send you some links to the resources mentioned during today's session, as well as a link to the recording of today's webinar, so keep an eye out for that in your inbox. To stay updated on the latest publications and informations from IBAC, you can subscribe to our e-newsletter through the IBAC website. We'll share the link also in the chat. We also regularly share updates on social media via X, LinkedIn and YouTube, so check those out as well. Finally, this webinar has come to an end, and you'll see when you exit Zoom that you'll see a link to complete a short feedback survey to help us plan for future events. You can also use the QR code on the screen to access the survey. We really do take that feedback on board and take it very seriously to plan future events. So we'd appreciate if you could provide us with your thoughts on today's webinar. We look forward to seeing you again at future events. Thank you.